Hello, Dr. Marlette. How are you?
I'm just fine, Deacon Fred. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing okay. Hanging in there.
Yes, sir.
How is everybody doing? I see a lot of blanks names, but no faces. Just Charlie and Janet and Aurora. Those are these.
Good evening, Deacon Fred. This is Deacon Abby.
Hey, Abby. How are you? How you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
I think we can start at 7:01. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Deacon Fred, and I'm the Director of Pastoral Ministry for the Archdiocese of San Francisco. Again, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you. I can't believe that this is our fifth session. Time flies by when you're having a good time, I guess. So we have, so anyway, again, welcome everyone, and I don't want to waste the time and take more time from Dr. Marlowe. So without further ado, Dr. Marlowe, the floor is all yours. If you can start us with an opening prayer, and let's hit that immigration thing.
Oh, we will. No doubt about that. Pardon me while I mute my, close the video for a second so I can read my prayer. If you all will join with me in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty and everlasting God, our source of power and inspiration, give us strength and joy in serving you as followers of Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
I'm getting there. Okay. So, yeah, Deacon Fred's right. I was looking at my notes and I earlier this morning and mistakenly clicked on immigration day number 4, and that was last week. So we have tonight and next week, and next week's a time for goodbyes. But I'm very grateful for this opportunity. It's always wonderful to see everybody log on. It is a great gift to see the different kinds of folks who are interested, and I hope I enjoy talking about these things and bringing these issues to you, and I hope it's bringing something to you as well. So there's that. When I set these up and discussed this course with Deacon Fred and Martin Ford, and Valerie Smalls, I had a night like tonight in place with my area of specialization And religious studies, like what I did my research on, not what I teach. I teach all sorts of classes, but this is my bread and butter. So this is and it is our story. Every single one of you who's logging on here tonight has a place in these slides, and not just at the end. I saw Mary Rose's comment, you don't want to see my face after practicing immigration all day. Maybe not quite those words, Mary Rose, but that same kind of sentiment about practicing immigration only because that's who people are and they need help. That is something the church has been doing for centuries. And part of this overview tonight is not just to kind of like look at, like to kind of relive the good old days or something like that, but there really is an element. Some of you might remember the George Santayana phrase, like those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And some of the immigration problems besetting us now in 2020, the 21st century, it's the same kind of issue from the 19th century. So this history is history that helps and informs and empowers. I'll talk about 3 articles at the end, one by David Albertson from Commonwealth American Paganism, David Cloutier's piece, Immigration is Always Oversimplified from Church Life Journal this summer, is fantastic. And then Daniel Horan's Naming the Dehumanizing Agent of Some Christians from National Catholic Review is, it's a little bit shorter but touches on some of the Catholic social justice themes and issues we've talked about so far in this course. And we'll look at this notion of the American Catholicism's reality as the immigrant church that hasn't changed. Look at some of the themes that come out of this history, like church autonomy, parish autonomy, probably church authority and parish autonomy, and the interaction between immigration and social activism. And then the ways in which Catholic social justice or Catholic social thought informs these themes of authority and autonomy and immigration and activism. The name The Immigrant Church actually is a book title from 1975 by the historian Jay Dolan, who was from Bridgeport, Connecticut. His dad ran a bar, and Jay Dolan grew up in the apartment over the bar in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So working class Irish guy, and taught for a long time at Notre Dame in Indiana. And one of the things that he kind of like spells out about this is that since European contact, starting with Spain and France, the church has always been an immigrant church. And prior to the real waves of immigration, there was a Republican small arm, meaning from the time founding of the Republic, around the time of the Revolutionary War. There was kind of like a colonial prehistory that includes states like Maryland, which I think probably it's on the East Coast. That makes sense. One of the 13 original colonies. Pennsylvania, another one of the original colonies, and the state of Kentucky, or the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And that's one state that a lot of times people aren't accustomed to hearing about when you hear about Catholic history. But some of the earliest foundations of frontier Catholicism, if you're not talking about the Catholic Church in Texas, Louisiana, and California, well, you all are, on the East Coast, one of the states that comes up first actually is not New York or Massachusetts, but Kentucky. And the reason why this particular history is important is that this history holds some practices and themes which have been recovered at times as well. Like this is not the first time we've done this, namely a lack of institutional structures. And effectively in the colonial area in places like rural Kentucky and Western Maryland, the Catholic Church was effectively a kind of congregationalist structure. That is to say that, every town had, a Catholic congregation that would meet weekly, even if a priest was not there. And effectively that parish in whatever town they were functioned on its own. They raised their own money, they built their own building, and the connection to the bishop was not terribly well defined. And the theme is this, is that like once immigration starts in the 1840s, comes a need for greater organization. And this is where some people would say the trouble starts, or or the good things that start to happen. Because one of the themes that this might speak to directly to some people's experiences, certainly does on the East Coast, is that the the largest waves and some of the first waves of Catholic immigrants coming to the United States prior to the Civil War and starting it in the 1840s are Irish immigrants. Um, and they very quickly, because of their numbers and a couple other um, issues that I'll mention here, very quickly come to control the edifice of the Catholic Church in America. In other words, they're the ones who are the priests, they're the nuns who run the schools, and they are a lot of the people filling up the pews, but not all. And the other thing, which you might want to jot down in a note somewhere, is the other thing that happens is that the Irish are the immigrants who already speak the language of the host nation because they speak English. And everybody else who's a Catholic immigrant ends up following the Irish. I'm trying to find the verb there, you can tell, because the Irish can speak English. And what this sets up, as we'll find out, and Jay Dolan, so he's writing about his own group, if you want to think of it that way. But even in 1975, Jay Dolan realized that one of the problems or issues with ongoing issues of immigration to the Catholic Church is, and this starts here with the Irish, is that the earlier immigrants then hold the more recent immigrants to a standard which is very difficult to meet, if not impossible to meet, because we're already up here and you're down here, but there's a kind of like a narrative we'll find it like, well, we were down here like you were once too, so you need to become more like us. And that ends up causing tension. It caused tension in the 1840s in New York City, and there are elements of the same kind of tension between the Irish and everybody else in the Catholic Church, quite frankly, in San Francisco and Los Angeles. So this covered this kind of theme here of tension between Irish Catholic, Irish American hegemony, and everybody else. It travels well, if you want to think of it that way. And so, like I said, there's even as the Irish themselves are dealing with being an immigrant subculture. So the Irish, if you want to think of it this way, when you read the histories that focus on Irish immigration, the Irish see themselves as being stuck between everybody else in the Catholic Church and the kind of like wide variety of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who don't accept them. This is not the place to go off into a tangent right here about this, but like one of the things that was being discussed, and I'll actually show you the image here in a little bit, is that there were discussions throughout the 1800s, the 19th century, about, okay, the Irish are a race. What kind of race are they? And they were, in some people's racialized discussions, the Irish were deemed to be not white. So, wherever each of us is with discussions of race in the United States in 2020, and a discussion of like how people identify with racial groups, perhaps in contrast to what they look like in terms of their physical appearance, those same kind of conversations were going on. Like they pointed directly at the Irish. The other group that this kind of like question about like racial identity falls on among Catholic immigrants first were Italians, especially because most Italian immigrants came from southern Italy. And so if people were coming from Sicily, there were presumptions about some of these Italian immigrants might actually be African. And you realize, after the Civil War, where there are segregation laws already put on the books in a number of American states, being designated as African carried with it a pretty, that carried definite social and economic ramifications, obviously. So it looks pretty bloodless when I type it up there on a slide, but there's a lot going on there. Meanwhile, and some of this might seem very familiar to some of you, depending on age and experience, there's what Dolan calls as devotional Catholicism, that there's a universe of meaning, that the Catholic system, the school, the church, the cemetery, the professional, or like the working conditions, the neighborhoods, everything fits together to create what he calls a universe of meaning, like the family. So it's not just Catholic identity is something that you do for a certain time on a Sunday with other Catholics, and that's it. This is an entire, system of neighborhood, of extended family relationships, of various Catholic feast days that punctuate, kind of like the weekly and monthly routines. And so there's that the word that gets oftentimes used here as Catholics start to build up money is it's what's called brick and mortar Catholicism, which exists on the West Coast and in southern states like Texas and Louisiana just as much as it does up here in the Northeast. In another book in 1985, Dolan listed 4 elements of this. The first one is authority. Kind of makes sense if you're talking about Irish Catholics, like, and the church has authority, that human structures reflects God's power. And so the church was due in obedience because in this system, it literally represented God on earth. There's a notion of sinfulness, and hence, and you can see that comes right after authority. So there's a kind of like regulatory notion in the church's authority, but then this is part of Dolan's point. This spreads out into that rest, that universe of meaning. So people start to regulate themselves and other people in their social group or their families. There's also a connection with ritual. Now, this obviously focuses on celebrating, like an attending mass and then eventually receiving communion. But the rituals of saying the rosary, a festival for Mary of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, for example, which is a thing even here in the Albany, Troy, Schenectady area where I live, that so the rituals aren't just quote unquote churchy rituals, but they're Catholic social rituals which include the church but then extend beyond it. And then finally, kind of like wrapping all this up, and this is Dolan's point here, is that the Catholic people participating in the system, where there were Germans, Irish, Filipinos, whoever, Italians, French Canadians, like my wife's family, they expected that through these elements of Catholic culture, that the divine would break into, that you could see the presence of God, in all these various kinds of Catholic settings. So that doesn't mean that you say the rosary once and automatically the skies open up and the light shines and you get it. It's not that simplistic, but rather that, by participating in all this day in and day out, and this is men and women, children, the old, the young, parents, whoever, the religious, priests and, and the clergy and the religious sisters, everyone expected that the divine was not far and away, that through the system, it could be brought right into your life. And then all these other elements helped shape your response. So you respond appropriately. So we all kind of like fit together. That's one of the reasons why the saints then put a personal, accessible face on the divine. And obviously, the role of Mary plays an important point. Obviously, this is something that immigrants are bringing over from Europe primarily, or up from Spanish colonies from Mexico on south. But also, as I put here, she's human, so there's this emphasis on purity and holiness. So this later on starts to inspire the way in which Catholics write about the church, that Mary's immaculate conception is a way of prefiguring the infallibility of the church, for example. You see things like that. But the other thing about this is that Mary is one Christian symbol that the Protestants do not have. So if you've ever kind of like looked around wherever you are in the United States, like American Catholics, like why the Virgin Mary? And it's not just because somebody in Rome or a bishop said she's your mother, although obviously she is. So it's not just a matter of authority or they told us to. It's also, and it's not just, it's based on, like she appears to us. If you want to think of Our Lady of Guadalupe, like she appeared to us in St. Juan Diego, but also she's not them. And the them in this case are oftentimes the Protestant leaders who are either denigrating and looking down upon Catholic immigrants. So there's a real kind of, identity former with Mary at a real human level, in addition to all the spiritual things. And so, if you've ever wondered, like, why is it called the University of Notre Dame? There you go. Why is it St. Mary's College? And I'm going to say it's either Moraga or Moraga. Moraga. How do you say that, Deacon?
Moraga.
Moraga. Okay. See, it's just different enough. Like every once in a while, my Midwesternism gets a hell of me. Like I can see a lot of people I grew up with calling that Moraga, but that's why I ask. So, so is there devotion behind that? Of course there is. Like I'm not trying to undermine it, but there's that kind of like immigrant, like we're gonna make it, and we've got our own things that we brought. We didn't just come empty-handed. And to kind of different set of comments or research field, the Virgin Mary's appeared in various places here in the United States, and that's a little different than what I'm talking about here, because the minute you start having Mary appear to, like, pick one of the people attending, like listening tonight, or anybody you meet on the street, then that goes back to stepping outside of that very first theme I mentioned about stepping outside of the bounds of authority. So Mary is important, but when Mary starts to go, off the grid map, you can see the church's authority thing. And I'll just hang on a second here. So, for example, one of the places, and this is on my side of the country, I apologize for mentioning this, but for example, one place where Mary has appeared several times to a visionary, and the visions were not accepted by the local ordinary, the local bishop, were on Long Island starting back in the late 60s. And that went on for about a decade. And, and then it was over. It's also places like Wisconsin, because the kind of message the person claimed Mary was delivering was very critical of the institutional structure. So you can see that the institution has an interest in cultivating Marian piety, but then you can see, like, when somebody comes back with some of these, like, very defamatory messages, like, okay, like, no. So it's this devotional Catholicism can in some ways be very much part of the institutional church. In other ways, at other times, and the immigrant church can go way, way over the boundaries. I don't want to make too much about this, but an example of this same kind of like border crossing with spirituality issue, I don't mean the actual international border, is Santa Muerta, the kind of like death saint. That's one of these other, like, a much more updated example of a facet of devotional Catholicism that does have some roots, in the mainstream tradition, that is like way, 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 what's being practiced today sometimes is very different than what the institutional church is saying. And so, like, my students, for example, want to find that because it's, way off in the margins, go, oh, well, look here, Dr. Marlette. I'm like, you gotta just be, that's nice that you found that, but that the presence of that alone doesn't invalidate all this other stuff here. And that's so that part of this is that this tension is ongoing historically in the church. Like I said, a holistic system involves the whole person. One of the things to notice about this is this immigration starts in the 1840s. There are a large number of Irish and then German immigrants. The Irish stay mostly in the Northeast and become the nation's unskilled labor force, especially in the Northeast and Midwest. And then kind of like closer to where I grew up, you have a wide variety of German immigrants, not just German Catholics, but German Lutherans, German Baptists, and even some German Jews moving to Cincinnati and St. Louis. And so we have what's called the German Triangle. And then because of this German-Irish tension, even as the other immigrant groups start to come in, and this also includes as the church moves largely from the east to the west coast, what start to develop, and they start doing this in Spanish-speaking areas in, along the border, so Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, some of whom already have their own dioceses. As English speakers and English-speaking Catholic immigrants come to these areas, they develop what are called, I put here, national parishes, which were ethnic centers within the predominantly Irish American English speaking hegemony. So if you were German, French Canadian, Lithuanian, Italian, pick an ethnicity that's not Irish. As the country, as the nation kind of like gains its, Catholic Episcopal seats around the country, these things get developed as a place where, okay, we need to find some way to serve Italians in St. Louis. So we'll make St. Ambrose on the Hill, which is the old Italian neighborhood of St. Louis. That's where Joe DiMaggio, or not Joe DiMaggio, Joe Garagiola and Yogi Berra grew up. Joe DiMaggio is from your neck of the woods. I apologize. Now, as a result, that's what leads to this. Some of you have probably seen this is from 1875, Harper's Weekly. This is the equivalent of publishing something on the front page of CNN.com. Thomas Nast was well known for his anti-Catholic sensibilities. This is the least offensive of them. Some of the other descriptions, if you've ever seen the drawings of Irish immigrants looking like apes with bottles of whiskey and sticks in their hands and are always getting into fights with each other or beating up African Americans or Chinese immigrants, that comes from Thomas Nast. And this is the famous one from 1875, the American River Ganges. As you can see, there's got St. Peter's Basilica in the background. And the bishops coming out of the water from a foreign area are shaped like crocodiles. And you see they've got the poor Protestants pinned right here up against the wall. And then the Irish are taking people off to lynch them. You've got to see the U.S. public school system is in ruins because the fear is that as Catholic immigration kept increasing before the Civil War and during the Civil War, and then afterwards, the rest of like white Protestant America felt they're being invaded. And the interesting reason why I put this up here is that, interestingly enough, like I said, that's why I started with the other stuff first. What this did was this actually put a wedge of, like the Irish who were, like I said, kind of foreign, but not as foreign as all the other Catholic immigrants, get stuck in the middle as both the acceptable face of Catholic immigrants, but but they're still connected to the church here, and and this is also a time where at least this is right after Pius IX lost the Papal States in the city of Rome, but there's a real emphasis on the foreignness of Catholic immigrants, that They are different and unmeltable, to using the term the melting pot. And so you would think that something like this would galvanize Catholic identity against everybody else. And it did to an extent, but that galvanization had layers to it. So again, if you were Italian, French Canadian, any kind of Slavic immigrant Catholic, and then the great unspoken reality with all of this 1800 stuff, of course, is that a chunk of what are becoming the United States in California and the Southwest, Spanish-speaking Catholics have already been here for centuries and suddenly find themselves on the other north of the border and getting roped into these kinds of conversations. And they're not even on the, in the minds of the East Coast Catholics having all these arguments. So a lot of the stuff right here is very East Coast and Midwest, I realize. And for any of you who are not in the Midwest or the Northeast tonight listening to this, a number of the kind of like Catholic communities that have been around for, like I said, for centuries already by the time this was published, they found themselves really without a voice. So that's it's kind of like a interesting, very inflammatory comment there. What happens is the church in the rest of the world starts to send priests to the United States to serve this burgeoning, diverse church, and only with foreign missionary assistance. So the numbers grow sufficiently. I park my open parentheses there. Another example, like I mentioned last week, this is where Sister Mother Frances Cabrini comes in as seeking to herself an immigrant, becomes a naturalized citizen, but seeks to build up. So like the missionary societies bring the priests, that's the sacramental part. And then in much larger numbers, working in schools and setting up orphanages are immigrant Catholic women who are religious, from religious orders, to set up all that other part of that Catholic immigrant universe I just mentioned. So you have the priests coming in to serve, and then you have, in large numbers, you can see, and then you have the sisters coming in much larger numbers to basically do a lot of the other things. The bishops start meeting in plenary councils from all over the country. The one in 1884, the third plenary council, met in Baltimore. And this is the council of 1884 of American bishops that requires that every Catholic parish, when it can, build a school. So that kind of, so the Catholic schools have like a start, they certainly existed beforehand, but this kind of like widespread notion that every parish has a school to go with it, it starts there. Also, the founding of the Apostolic Delegate, who's the Pope's personal representative. So the Apostolic Delegate resides in Washington, D.C., like the national capital. The thing to recognize here, and I mentioned this last week, Baltimore is the first Episcopal see founded in what becomes the United States in 1789. Actually, it's in 1789. So that becomes the first. And so like the traditional authority throughout the 1800s is Baltimore, but very quickly Boston, New York City, because of the size and numbers of those churches start to grow. And this grows so much that in 1908, so a little bit more than 120 years, actually about right at about 120 years, the church goes from naming the first bishop in the country to having the missionary status removed, which meant the church was on solid footing enough to produce, we don't need to send foreign priests there to serve the church. And so that meant was, and that what fueled this were the number of Catholic immigrants that were kept coming in every year. So there were just so many Catholics in the United States in 1908 and a sufficient infrastructure to serve them that the missionary status was ended. So that's a remarkable accomplishment. You know, like a lot of people thought it was going to take a lot longer. Now, I might have been living in Albany, New York for the past 23 years, but I'm not from here. And some of this, what I just read to you, is even foreign. So my wife is from Maine, and some of those themes that I just read to you all don't even make sense when you look at the history of Catholicism in Maine. Maine is much more like, you know, part of like the upper Midwest in that sense. You know, it's very rural, and while there was like an Irish Catholic hegemony there as well, the large ethnic group in Maine, of course, are French Canadians, which has an entirely and that's unique because kind of like Spanish-speaking Catholics with Mexico, the ethnic homeland is on the same continent, whereas the Irish, the Italians, the Germans, the Poles have an ocean to cross again. And I mention all that because you can see here, and I noticed that someone in the course tonight is also from Louisiana, so you can put Louisiana here as well. This Catholic immigrant reality, the schools, all the authority, the miraculous, all those things I just mentioned. When you get to these other parts of the country, those elements are there, but they're interacting with different parts of, you know, the American tapestry. So in the Midwest, there are a lot of Germans out there, but not all the Germans in the Midwest are German Catholics. You have a number of German Lutherans and German Baptists, so kind of like German evangelicals. And of course, not every Lutheran is German. There are Norwegians and Danes and Swedes and Finns, especially if you move to the upper Midwest like Minnesota. But the cities, you know, St. Louis, Chicago, even Indianapolis, Milwaukee, have a lot more in common with Buffalo. Now, Texas and California, this applies here. There's not immigration. It's just that the border, they didn't move, the border did. And so, and this is really something that's really only come to light really in the past maybe 30 years about Catholic history in Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and really even Louisiana, where people are speaking French, is that what you have instead of people, so the Catholic populations in these areas get called immigrant, but they're already here. You know, like at least in New Mexico, the Catholic roots in New Mexico predate almost all of the history of New England, except the very early origins in places like Boston and some other places like that. You know, like it's that the Catholic history of New Mexico and parts of California is just as old as colonial. This is kind of like, you know, like founding father stuff here in New England. And then in Texas, you then start getting European immigration that resembles Midwestern states. So you have like a large influx in southern Texas of German and Czech farmers, which are that those heritages are still there. Same thing in California. Now, the one thing, of course, with California, and this involves things like labor history, are, you know, as people come from Europe to the United States and first land in places like Boston and New York, when people immigrate from Asia and come to the United States, they're going to come to California cities first. So this is something that I think a lot of you are familiar with. And the interesting thing is that as Irish Catholic hegemony reaches San Francisco, the same issues pop up. You know, they're almost immediately, you know, in the early days of the San Francisco Archdiocese, you have Irish Catholic hegemony, just like you do in Albany. It's just that, you know, very quickly, San Francisco's church history comes to reflect the immigrants around us. So there are European immigrants, but then also Asian immigrants. And then this Asian immigration then effectively, it kind of makes sense, it ends up on the coastlines. So after California, one of the next big locations for Asian, especially Chinese immigration, is New York City. you'd be amazed to see that. You should see the look on my face, the faces of my students when I tell them, you know, the New York City Police Department has had Mandarin speakers on the force for over 120 years because, you know, New York City's Chinatown, the Lower East Side, the police force realized, again, this is a police force populated primarily with Irish Irish American cops, realized pretty quickly that if they want to police Chinese neighborhoods in New York, they're going to have someone who speaks the language. And that becomes, you know, that's a reality that law enforcement and people dealing with immigration, they realize, you know, like Spanish, Mandarin, you know, like depending on what neighborhood you're in or what part of the West, a familiarity with a language other than English is very helpful. So that's kind of an important thing to kind of keep in mind there. Is like a lot of my students kind of think like, oh, immigration is, you know, this old thing, and they don't even like, and a lot of students know about Chinese immigration, but they never think that like that would affect something like the police force in New York. Mentioned obviously Vatican II is very important, but what Vatican II does it opens a set of conversations which then lead to this. And I think this is something that I think that there's a stereotypical way of understanding. It's kind of like American Catholicism, maybe people are kind of going their way and doing their own thing. And I mentioned Humanae Vitae here, but you might want to jot down your notes. The other place where you see American Catholics willing to disagree with church teaching come on things like immigration and things like the economy. And those kinds of disagreements actually predate the so-called liberal disagreement with the church over things like birth control and abortion. So I want to say that again, you know, so like both liberal and conservative, you know, voices in American Catholicism have taken upon themselves to disagree with church teaching in the 60s. And to some degree, the conservatives actually got there first because they're disagreeing with John the 23rd on Mater et Magistra, on the church's teaching on the economy, actually. And there still is an element of anti-Catholic prejudice in this country, the so-called last acceptable prejudice, which is a line from 1941, about Catholics being foreign and therefore unmeltable, and also Catholics being, you know, duty bound or blindly obedient to their bishops. So I'm sure probably some of you are kind of chuckling. They don't know us very well. Like, yeah, externally, that still, even in 2020, you'd be amazed at how many people think that's how Catholics are, that like the bishop says jump and everyone says how high. And that stereotype, therefore, of rebelling against a bishop's authority comes to take on a certain kind of like American theme. So you can see here that like this then becomes, sometimes it gets held up as like, you know, well, you can tell they're immigrant Catholics because they still listen to the clergy too much. Like that becomes like a way of denigrating immigrants even more so, not just denigrating them for their foreignness, but also as a way of like weaving a Catholic thread into their anti-immigrant stance. Vatican II's changes are important because nationally, the United States, starting in 1965, dramatically overhauled immigration policy. Prior to 1965, there were very strict quotas, basically on immigration from any country where people weren't white, effectively. And the 1965 immigration laws dropped these quotas on Asian and African countries. So what this did was, first of all, this is why I mentioned Vatican II, like the kind of like interreligious dialogue and the kind of like opening up to the world, is that now all these different religious communities that previously we just kind of like read about, and they sometimes kind of existed in New York City, maybe San Francisco, Suddenly now, since 1965, there are Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs all over the country. Some of the largest mosques are now outside of places like Toledo, Ohio, Smyrna, Tennessee, which is a suburb of Nashville. There's an enormous Hindu temple outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And so just the nature of immigration itself has changed. And in these situations, especially with the first three, the Sikhs are a little different, although their buildings aren't as big, but everybody, most of us know and see Sikhs when we see them because the men have the turbans with the beards. And I have to tell my students, if you see a man with a beard, a mustache, and a turban, hearing that he's probably a Sikh, not a Muslim, and that's because they're not the same religion. And this then again emphasizes immigrant difference, but along with it, as you can see, I put here, Vietnamese and other Christians fleeing war zones, and then Christian immigration from the East in general starts to accelerate. So the Philippines, Pakistan, and other parts of the Middle East, whether they're affected by war or not, these immigrant groups come to the United States. So like even the very notion of Christian immigrants diversifies dramatically in the past 55 years. And so therefore, the question of like over asylum seekers and the Trump administration has dramatically shrunk the number of asylum seekers who are accepted every year. And one of the things that the bishops get involved with then is seeking to expand the number of asylum seekers as broadly as possible, not just for people coming from like war-torn countries like Christians in the Middle East, although that's obviously one place where these are not just people who are seeking asylum, but they're also our brothers and sisters in faith. But this asylum seekers status is also extended to people fleeing drug trafficking wars in Central and South America. And the recent rise, and David Cloutier's article that I posted for this week talks about this. Latino immigration, even up through the 70s and 80s, still primarily was a man immigrating first, sending money back, and then eventually the family coming up. In the past 5 to 7 years, the nature of Latino immigration has changed dramatically. Now you have entire families fleeing altogether. So this is where you have, women and children traveling on their own. And the responses, even within the church, to replicate this earlier kind of like tension between trying to assimilate into the host country and then in the host country responding to what's called nativism, like we're here first. If you're going to come in here, you have to like be like us. So exactly. So it's kind of like we didn't have to melt, but you have to the more recent immigrants. And this then has that past and the American Ganges and the bishops looking like crocodiles climbing out of the water then has come back again in the American church, where you have the tension of yes, these immigrants are Catholic, but they're not Catholic like we are. And then finally, and we'll talk about this next week, every year during a national election cycle, the bishops release another issue of Faithful Citizenship, and it always addresses the immigration policy shortcomings that are present. So basically one of the things the bishops have said is we've never fully gotten our heads around what it means to have a comprehensive, mutually beneficial immigration policy as a nation. Not just talking about how the church deals with immigration, but as a nation, as part of the common good, we need to address these issues. So you have the church dealing with immigration internally, and then externally, the church is also dealing with the needs of immigration, or the nation's need to deal with immigration as a national issue. So I put a fourth article that's in at the end of the notes tonight. David Cloutier teaches at Catholic University, and his piece is entitled "Immigration is Always Oversimplified" from both sides, either too political or too individualistic. And one of the things he gets into with Pope Paul VI's encyclical from 1967, Populorum Progressio, is a way of looking. So we have a way of looking at our own lives as vocations, like wherever you all are tonight, talking about we've developed a way of which, kind of like our Protestant sisters and brothers, talking about like where God wants us to be in this life right now. And so one of the things Cludier says, that's very American, like what does God want from me? But the Pope has taught that God wants something good for everybody. And so to look at immigrant lives as having a vocation too. And so therefore it's not whether or not we should help immigrants, we should, but rather what can we do to help them to recognize their vocation, a calling from God here. Now that they're here, like what is their vocation here? So trying to expand that, a very familiar conversation for us personally, to the immigrant other. Just today, I put on this from Father Joseph, posted a reflection on Fratelli Tutti, which also talks about this notion of like a common humanity. So there's a similar, that doesn't mention immigration specifically, but it connects with Cloutier's piece. And then David Albertson and Father Haran's articles raised questions about American assimilation, because one of the things Father Haran's the one, like the second article here, makes it pretty clear, is that one problem with assimilating too much into American life is that then you end up taking on these anti-immigrant stereotypes that Catholics themselves once fought against. So Haran makes it pretty clear, his piece is the shortest of these four, is that it's pretty clear that not every part of American life Catholics should assimilate into, because some of them, quite frankly, are wrong and sinful, like racism. And Albertson's piece about power, it has that very gripping photo of the young girl crying because her mother is an immigrant, is being arrested by the border police. And so she's like this little toddler who was bawling her eyes out in the dark. And Albertson's piece is a reflection on what people call paganism. And it's actually a worship of power. And he brings that back to a discussion of Catholic social justice with dignity, that a worship of power is denial of dignity in other people. And that's very moving, especially when you apply it to the otherness of immigration. That one of the things that makes immigration so politically charged, that he's saying, is that you can use power against immigrants who seem like they have no rights, and then this use of power comes to be celebrated, and it creates that divide. It's a denial of human dignity. So you've got like the Catholic social justice thing. But I hope from this evening you can see that one of the other things is Catholics get involved in these immigration issues when they're hostile to immigration. That's putting Catholics now on the side of, well, quite frankly, Thomas Nast. That puts us on the side of the people who once were opposed to us. If that makes any sense. And that's kind of so there's a historical element of the American Catholic Church that immigration is always there, and it's the theme that builds the church, and we need to be mindful of that. But in being mindful of that, we have to be aware of these issues that Albertson, Haran, Cloutier, and Father Joseph bring up about the ways in which that after immigrants have been here for a generation or two and have blended in, that they can't forget these moral and theological duties that they have to more recent immigrants. And so you can see like a balancing of issues there. So all three of these kind of like advance a good argument for talking about these immigration issues Cloutier's piece is the longest, and Albertson's piece is not easy. It gets into some philosophical stuff, but they're all three very moving. And then Father Joseph's reflection on Fratelli Tutti kind of like continues the conversation from last week that we had about the themes of the course and this, Pope Francis's vision of us reaching out to the other. And Father Joseph spent some time talking about how the encyclical hinges on the parable of the Good Samaritan, which precisely, even though he never mentions the word immigration, feeds directly into the material for this course, because Father Joseph's drawing attention to Pope Francis, saying like it's important that the Samaritan helps the wounded person. It's not, he overcomes, he reaches over the customary social barriers. So that's it for me tonight. I wanted to see what do we have in the chat. Hopefully no Fs, Jeff, here. Look what's around here. It's kind of like, so Melissa said, I post something here about priests in other nations. This is something, like I know, and I speak from my own experience. The Diocese of Albany, Diocese of Albany is on its second bishop since 1976. We've had two bishops, in the past 44 years. And Bishop Howard Hubbard, who was the bishop from 76 until 2013, and is a local native, like he's from Troy, New York, across the river from Albany. He decided that the Albany Diocese would not have any foreign born, like the diocese would produce its own clergy. And I can see where he's going, where he went with that, but then you don't have people serving. But then one of my colleagues I used to work with at St. Rose is retired now, is a retired Methodist pastor. The Methodist churches had no problem bringing in Methodist ministers from Nigeria. So he had this odd thing that, like the immigrant church in the Albany area sometimes was a Methodist church, not the Catholic church. And these same issues about immigration pop up, and then sometimes they actually get focused even more when the sacramental leader, the public face of the community, is visibly and linguistic and audibly different than the community he's serving. It puts a great amount of tension on everybody. My wife's family, who are from the French Canadians who now live in the Worcester, Massachusetts area, they've talked about that because one of their parish priests for a long time was actually from Poland. And so, so the same kind of issue, it's just he didn't have like the visual racial component there, but a couple of the priests spoke Polish, like you do when you're from Poland. And so they even struggled with that because none of them do Polish. Most of them still didn't know that much French after all the years. And so in the schools, that's one place, the schools are another setting, because obviously the vast majority of the teachers of schools are lay people like me, which is not necessarily a diminution of Catholic identity, but it is a different kind of identity when a certain day when every teacher was a nun. And so like you can see like these tensions. I think that maybe I should have put a slide there. There's an immigrant tension within the parish with newness and just difference. And of course, one of the differences that people bring, if they're Catholic immigrants, they're going to bring their devotions with them. So I'm sorry, like a lot of the examples I give from my own experiences, but like as I tell my students, like look for your own examples. So one of the examples I was very aware of years ago in St. Louis was St. Pius V Parish, right? So a good Counter-Reformation saint, stick our feet, that's a real, thumbing your nose at the Protestants in the neighborhood. St. Pius V Parish was predominantly German. So the stained glass windows in the parish all had German writing at the bottom. All the donors were German. Everything's German. When I used to go to mass there in the mid 90s, the mass was in trilingual. Every mass had 3 languages: English, Spanish, because of the large Filipino population that was growing in South St. Louis, and I'm going to mispronounce this, but Hmong, the Vietnamese. So every language. So like if you went to mass 3 Sundays in a row, the Our Father one Sunday was in English, the next Sunday it's in Spanish, and the next Sunday it's in Vietnamese. That's one way of doing it.
Hmong is the correct pronunciation, and it's different than Vietnamese.
Thank you very much. And yes, as soon as you said that, I apologize. Melissa. Thank you for correcting me on that. And
The extent of my experience is reading The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, having a resident in my program that is Hmong and not Vietnamese people. So my extent of experience is not great,
that's,
but a little bit.
I'll take that. Someone just said, like, I'm not sharing my screen now. I hope I am. It looks like I am. Richard Rodriguez is one. That's the he's a well-known writer about those kinds of tensions. There's a lot of the Latino voice, if I can say it like that, Latino voice, has diversified dramatically, both in terms of not just church culture, but also American popular culture, just in terms of like music, literature, and that, that's, you could very quickly, when you start dealing with, Catholic, like Latino immigrant Catholicism, you very quickly can move kind of like Italian immigrants, the studies of Italian immigrants in Italian Harlem in the early 1900s. You move very quickly from the parish grounds into the street, and you can be in front of the church eating a variety of ethnic food, and the clear dividing line between like what's officially Catholic and what's a street fair is just erased. And I say that coming from the Midwest with my English and German roots, like that's very messy. and it's precisely that kind of like fear of messiness that our scholarship has told us we have to overcome. And like I said, that's why I put like the Kluge and Haran pieces in there, is that there's a willingness to kind of like engage the new realities, because the new realities are just the most recent chapter of what's always been going on. What's going on in American parishes now with immigrant diversity, especially in places like San Francisco and Texas and Louisiana, and parts of urban Chicago for that matter, like down the river from me in New York City. It's the same kind of ethnic tensions as you see dealing with the Irish and other European immigrant groups in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It's just that the ethnic groups are different. And Melissa, you're right. Like instead, now you have instead of everybody being some kind of European, the ethnic diversity within the Catholic Church has expanded exponentially. So there's what could be the kind of like different kinds of diverse communities can be astonishingly more different. They're even more diverse now than were. Yes, and Latinx. Thank you, Jesse, for saying that, because I go back and forth with that, because I've also seen people criticizing that. So I'm not, but that's fine too. And I've heard Latinx and Latinx, which to me sounds like a band. Sorry. Matt, I've talked with Matt off on emails, and that's one of the things that I have found with looking at recent Catholic immigration is that that's why I mentioned the 1965 immigration laws, is then you have, along with, because that's where you talk about like that word Islam in America, that numbers of Muslims grow dramatically after 1965. And that includes things like the Iranians and the war in Iraq and in Afghanistan, bring immigrants in. But
Just so-
those same laws, sorry, just a second, Melissa, those same laws also fuel immigration from the same areas of Asia. So there's a new influx of different kinds of Asian Catholicism as well. I'm sorry, Melissa. Go ahead. You're muted, Melissa. There we
Right,
go.
right. So you'd commented at one point that you wondered if you were screen sharing, and I just wanted to make sure you knew that we're in gallery view and you're not screen sharing at this point.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I can go back if there's anything anyone wants to see.
No, I
No,
just
okay.
I
Gotcha.
interpreted one comment that you made as being that you were still screen sharing. So
Okay. No, I was trying to.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying.
But,
I appreciate that.
But again, I think it's almost past 8 o'clock. I know it's past 11 o'clock your time.
Oh, yeah.
And so again, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Marlette, for a wonderful presentation and informative. I think from the comments, I could see that most people enjoyed it, and it was very informative, at least for me, and the resources that you put. But again, I think Dr. Marlette is available by email. If you have any questions, you can also email him. I'm sure he will be more than happy to answer. But before we leave, I'd like to ask Dr. Marlette to lead us in a closing prayer.
Be happy to. Just a second. God of love and compassion, may we always recognize your spirit in the refugee family, seeking safety from violence, and the migrant worker bringing food to our tables, and the asylum seekers seeking justice for their families, and the unaccompanied child traveling in a dangerous world. Give us hearts that break open whenever our brothers and sisters turn to us. Give us hearts that no longer turn deaf to their voices in times of need. Give us eyes to recognize a moment for grace instead of a threat. Give us voices that fail to remain silent, but which decide instead to advocate prophetically. And give us hands to reach out and welcome, but also in work for a world of justice until all homelands are safe and secure. We ask in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Sorry, I had to go off camera there for a second so I could read the prayer.
Yes.
Thank you all very much. Have a good night and a good
Thank
week.
you.
And I'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you so much, and have a great and blessed evening, everyone. And take care. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye now.